All right, welcome back. So we're going to talk today a little bit about a very important concept and perspective called the line of sight. So in my other perspective videos, and if you've ever done perspective, you know that you always have a horizon line, right? So there's my horizon line. Okay, and then we have, and this again is the true vertical line that goes through like a true vertical line going right through the middle of the back of your cornea, like a crosshair, like if you look through like binoculars or something like that, where you have a crosshair. This is the same thing, same concept. This would be the true horizontal line going through your eye, through the middle of it. This right here, this vertical line, is called the center of vision. Center of vision. All right, and again, this would be a true vertical line going through the middle of your cornea. So this right here would be the exact middle of your cornea. And from there, you know, you look outwards, or, you know, the light comes in through your eye, but you're looking outwards essentially, and you have, from this point, you would have a line, this little bamboo skewer here. And what this is this would be the line of sight. So from the middle point, from this middle point here, would be your line of sight, or, you know, and that's what, you know, that comes straight out from there through your eye and out as far as you can see. So the line of sight. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the line of sight. I'm going to use we're going to do a little setup here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what it is. All right. So the line of sight. So we're going to talk about the line of sight. And to do that, we're going to use these 4 books that I have. And these, now there's a little bit of camera distortion because of the way that the camera, I don't have a zoom lens on it. So these seem to be sort of bending a little bit. But all of these are truly in line. So I just want a little disclaimer. These are all perpendicular. In other words, they're 90-degree angles one to the other. Okay? All these are lined up. And for this, for this little guy, we've got just our little, this is our little gray outer space Martian, or what have you, with one eye. And so this right here is a little skewer that's supposed to be coming from what is supposed to be his eye. He's only got one eye. And so we're going to set our one-eyed creature down here. And to explain the line of sight, we're going to use an aerial view, like we're a little bird flying over, you know, this, looking down, flying over we'll just say this is a city right now, or these are big blocks, or these are buildings. And so these books will represent buildings. And you'll understand why in a second. So the line of sight comes out from your eye, you know, so it's what you can see. So we talked about the horizon line, that horizontal line, the center vision, which is the vertical line. And think of that as if you were wearing sunglasses, and on those sunglasses you had a vertical line and a horizontal line drawn on the lens, but you'd be seeing past that, you'd be seeing beyond that, and you'd be seeing beyond it on the line of sight. So this line of sight would continue. I know this stops right here, but we're just going to use our imagination and follow that line through and imagine that it continues on. Now, the line of sight is something that I talk about, you know, in my classes, like the first day, but we're going to remind you guys of it, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. So the first thing whenever we're drawing something is we have to ask ourselves are we dealing with 1-point or 2-point perspective? So that's the first thing that we ask. Which is it? And the way and what decides that is our line of sight. That's what describes whether we're seeing an object in 1-point perspective, or what we could call a front view, or 2-point perspective, which we could call a corner view. Pardon me. So in 2-point perspective, we'd call that a corner view. We'd see some of the corner, and we'll talk about that in a second. But as long as these objects, and I'm going to try to make sure that this is, again, right now, again, we do have some camera distortion, so these don't quite feel like they are in line, but they are. And this is actually, our little guy here is looking down, and this line, his line of sight is perpendicular, or 90 degrees to these objects. So that means that if he's viewing these objects, and they're 90 degrees to his line of sight, this is a 1-point perspective scenario. And it doesn't matter if he crossed the street and still looking straight ahead. So it wouldn't matter if he came over here and they're still perpendicular or pretty close to it, or if he came over here and he was perpendicular or pretty close to it, or whether he was, whoops, that kind of went a little nuts, or if he was in a little elevator where he was up off the floor but still looking straight ahead, or if he was down, if we dug a hole and he dropped down to that hole, as long as, and his eyes were peeking over the top of the hole, as long as he is perpendicular to these objects, that's 1-point perspective, just 1 point, okay? So now if he came over here across the street and turned his head, so now he's turned his head and his line of sight is no longer striking this object at 90 degrees. It's some other degree other than 90. That is a 2-point perspective view. So it doesn't, there's only one 1-point perspective view. After that, everything else is 2-point of some sort. Doesn't mean that all 2 points the same. It's not. It just means that it's 2-point perspective of some sort. And so again, it wouldn't matter if he was over here and turned his head, if he was, again, in an elevator and had turned his head. Wouldn't matter if he was down in a hole and had turned his head. As long as his line of sight is not perpendicular to these books, or what we are pretending are little buildings, then he's seeing these buildings in a 2-point perspective scene, or a 2-point perspective scenario. Now, buildings aren't going to move, but if we were actually, unlike a still life, and this was a book, of course, the other thing that could change is I could rotate the book, right? So again, this book would only be in 1 point when it was perpendicular to his line of sight. Whoops, about like so. About like right there. But the moment that we rotate the book and now it's no longer 90 degrees, that's 2-point. And if we continue, I'm going to have to move him over to do this. But if this continues to rotate, that's 2-point, and that would be 2-point, and that would be 2-point, 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 2-point. All different views, but they're all 2-point perspective views. 2-point, 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 until once again, this lined up to be perpendicular to his line of sight, and then we'd have a 1-point perspective scenario once again. Now the other thing that could happen, let's try to get this line back up real quick. Okay, well, we'll use our imagination and pretend it is the other thing he could do is, you know, if he began to we'll just lift him up a little bit. Let's say he turned his head. Well, now again he's seeing 2-point, turns his head more, 2-point, 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 until once again, if this is again perpendicular to this, now it's a 1-point perspective scenario. So everything seen going this direction would be in 1 point, and this might be part of his peripheral vision. But again, if he turns his head again, 2-point, 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 and once again 1 point. Okay, I think you guys probably understand the idea. Again, if these are all in line 90 degrees to his line of sight, that's a 1-point perspective scenario. Here's the other thing that we need to talk about, and this is really important because we're going to do a drawing of these books. And we need to understand that we can have different perspectives, different scenarios in the same scene. And so if I turn this book a little bit like this, I now have 2 sets of vanishing points, because these are all in 1 point to this person, but this book is in 2 points. So this is going to have a set of vanishing points. And when you have a set, it can either be a set with just 1 vanishing point, or a set with, either a set with 1 vanishing point or a set with 2 vanishing points. So again, these would all be 1 set because they are perpendicular one to the other. That is the only time that these objects will share the same vanishing point. So I showed you guys doing some boxes where all the boxes were going to their same vanishing points in 2 point, or 1 point. The only time that objects share vanishing points is if and only if they are perpendicular one to the other. So the moment this is not perpendicular to these, this has its own set of vanishing points. So again, we have 2 sets of vanishing points. What if I did this? We'll come the other way. Now we've got three sets of, oh, maybe this is easier, three sets of vanishing points. This has its own set. This has its own set. These are not perpendicular to one another, so they have two different sets. This has its own set. That has its own set. And these two still have the same set. Now, if I turned this one, now we have four sets of vanishing points. This has its own set. This has its own set. This has its own set. This has its set. We're going to set up a scene where we're going to have four different types of vanishing points because we're going to do this, set these books up. But anyone who's ever gone to maybe like a like some sort of bookstore or something, used bookstore or something else, and if you've ever seen someone do something like the fan, where you have all the different books are slightly turned. Okay, so if I had these books like this, and this bottom book right down here, this bottom book right down here on the bottom, if this bottom book is in, is perpendicular to the line of sight, this would be 1 point, and then this would be 2 point with its own set. This would be 2 point with its own set, and that would be 2 point with its own set. So again, whenever you're looking at an object, you have to identify how many sets of vanishing points am I dealing with. Now, most artists aren't going to, unless you're doing something super formal, still, you're never going to really set out more than 4 sets of vanishing points, anything more than that, and you're going to just tweak it slightly. You can get away with that. I got 4 sets, and if it's somewhere in between there, I'm just going to tweak things just a little bit. And that's fine if you understand perspective. If you don't understand, it can be kind of strange. So first off, we're trying to get you to understand how to identify how many sets we've got. And after you say, okay, well, there's 4 sets, well, then the next question is one of those sets in 1 point? Because if I did this, they're all in 2 point. All 4 sets are in 2 point. Nothing's in 1 point. But if I did, let's see if we can go ahead and continue to do this. Now this one is pretty much perpendicular with the line of sight. So this would be 1 point, 2 point, 2 point, and 2 point. 4 different sets, but this one's in 1 point, and the rest are in. This one is in 1 point, and the rest of these are in 2 point. So whenever we're drawing, we need to identify, and the first question we ask ourselves is, how many sets of vanishing points are there? Let's go back to that where we had these set out like as if we were looking at a cityscape. Now with a cityscape, usually you're only going to have, the buildings are usually lined up. Every once in a while you get one that's set at a 45-degree angle, but most times all the buildings are going to share vanishing points because they're set up perpendicular, right? The roads, and again, not always. You're going to have, sometimes you'll have a road cut at an angle because of the layout of the city and the way the landscape is. But still, still you're going to have sections again of that city where you've only got 1 set of vanishing points. But let's say we said, all right, well, let's do this. What if we had this and this? Now I'm trying to set these up so they're parallel one to the other. And we have 4 books, but we only have 2 sets of vanishing points. These 2 are perpendicular, and they will share the same vanishing point. And these 2 will share the same vanishing point because they're perpendicular. And these 2 are in 1 point, and these 2 are in 2 point. And then we'd say, well, all right, let's do this. And we say, all right, well, now how many vanishing points are there? How many sets? And we say, well, there's still only 2 sets. Now these 3 share a set, and this one is its own set. This would be in 1 point. These would be in 2 point. And if I did this, now we still have 2 sets, but this is no longer 2 point. This is no longer 1 point. This is now a 2 point. These guys are all now 2 point because none of them are lining up perpendicular to this person's, our little alien here from Mars or whatever. None of them are lining up to that line of sight. Okay, so whereas if we did something a little bit more askew where everything's kind of just a little, skitty-wampus one to the other. Again, now we've got 4 sets of vanishing points. And none of these are in 1 point. All these are in 2 point. This is close, but not quite. He is off just a ways. So these would be 4 different sets of vanishing points, 4 different angles, but none of them are in 1-point perspective because nothing is perpendicular to this creature's line of sight, or in our case, our line of sight. The other thing to remember is that we have 2 eyes, right? So when we have 2 eyes open, we have 2 lines of sight. And when we're drawing something that's complex in perspective, those 2 lines of sight will give us 2 different pictures, 2 different images. And it will confuse your drawing. Whenever you're drawing, especially something that's hardcore perspective, cityscapes, drawing cars or trucks, or I don't know, we draw a bicycle or what have you, and you're trying to figure it out by hand, you want only 1 line of sight. Close 1 eye. It will simplify and clarify your drawing. So we've talked about the line of sight. We're going to be using this. Whenever you look at something, you're going to try to be more aware of your line of sight. You're going to be more aware of what is perpendicular to your line of sight and what is not. And it will help you immensely in your drawing. This has been Kevin McCain with Kevin McCain Studios and Idaho Art Classes. Y'all take care. Be more creative. Bye-bye.